You tell us also in paragraph 2 of your witness statement that in your 5 years in office, problems with Horizon barely came across your desk. Is that right?
That is correct, and when they did, it was usually in a very uncontroversial way, and it was not drawn to my attention as an issue I should focus on.
That 5-year period was a significant one in relation to the unfolding events concerning Horizon, including within that 5-year period, because campaigning work was being undertaken by the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. There was the threat of a class action being brought against the Post Office in the courts. There had been the discovery of evidence in that 5-year period which cast doubt on the safety of criminal convictions obtained by the Post Office when acting as a private prosecutor. The CCRC, the Criminal Cases Review Commission, had commenced an investigation into the safety of some convictions. At Second Sight, the forensic accountants had been instructed and had produced 4 reports in that 5-year period. It marked the beginning, middle and end of the initial complaint and mediation scheme run by the Post Office. Deloitte, forensic accountants, had completed reports on the Horizon system. I've given you a smattering of things that happened in that 5-year period where you say Horizon barely came across your desk. Looking at it in the round, how do you think it is that Horizon barely came across your desk in that 5-year period?
Well, I think the general reason is that the officials who were briefing me and the ministers on the subject hadn't seen it as a particular problem. I think with hindsight, I should have been told at the outset about Horizon, what it was. It was just a word. I should have been told that people were querying it, good, competent people, Computer Weekly, for example. I knew nothing of their work. We should have been told that people were suggesting there was a risk factor. And I should have been told about Mr. Bates and the Justice Group. I never heard his name until I'd been in the job 5 years. At the end, when the whole issue came to a head, but certainly I wasn't briefed on them, and I think probably this came down to civil servants making a judgment that because I had a vast area of responsibility and because it was being well handled at a minister level, that I didn't need to be told about them.
Thank you. You tell us in paragraph 4 of your witness statement that governments across the political spectrum share some responsibility for the fact that the scandal happened on their watches and that you accept your share of responsibility.
Yes, to be frank, I found it very difficult to pinpoint particular events or decisions that I could have done differently, but simply as a matter of formal responsibility, this was a state enterprise that came within the remit of my department, and I accept the fact that it happened on our watch. I know that's a cliche, but it's something that ministers have to recognise.
You say here that Pole Middle management was authoritarian, and you recognise the description of them applied by Sir Alan as thugs in suits. What about your dealings with them led you to those views?
Well, it was the description of what happened when, well, in the particular case I brought to Parliament, but I heard of others, about what happened when a postmaster made a mistake. I mean, in the case of my constituent, the only thing that we could identify was that a Twickenham resident had gone into the post office and found that the person behind the counter didn't know that Santiago was the capital of Chile. And a complaint had been made, and on the basis of this complaint, she had a franchise taken away from her. Certainly when I raised that issue and closures with the post office officials who I met around closures, the attitude came across to me very much as it was described here.
It was as a result of meeting them face to face?
It was indeed, and through the attitude that was revealed in correspondence at the time.
If we turn to the period when you took up office, that can come down from the screen, thank you. When were you first aware of individual sub-postmasters challenging the Post Office's enforcement action against them?
I wasn't aware of that at all. I knew that there were these fraud cases because, as I've mentioned, I had this delegation brought to me by Mr. Bridgen, and I had asked the Post Minister what action we were taking, and it was at that point that I was told about Second Sight, the forensic accountant, and I think reasonably assumed that there was now a process to deal with it. But that was the only occasion on which this came to my attention.
When did you first become aware that Post Office both investigated and privately prosecuted its own sub-postmasters and mistresses?
Well, I wasn't aware specifically about that differentiation. I think the kind of common way of looking at it was that if somebody was charged with fraud, it was all a matter to do with the police and the courts. The distinction that you draw and subsequently emerged was not something I was aware of.
Not aware of at any time in your period of office?
Well, I think right at the end, when we had this coming together of Mr. Arbuthnot's question in Parliament and the report of the Select Committee, I started to ask a lot of questions about what was going on, and I think that was one of the issues which emerged, but until then, the question had never arisen.
When did you first become aware of concerns that sub-postmasters had been prosecuted on the basis of Horizon data which may not be reliable?
Well, I think it was then, very much at the end of the Parliament, when we had that coincidence of events, and I was brought into the picture.
That sentence, or those sentences, there is no evidence of system-wide problems with Horizon, and that conclusion has stood firm through nearly 2 years of investigation. Was that a suggestion put to you by officials?
Well, it was, but I wanted, because I was confronting the issue really for the first time, I wanted reassurance from the postmasters that that was indeed the case, and I had asked the officials to check with the Federation whether this was indeed their understanding, and I was told that it was, and that the General Secretary or the head of the union had appeared before the Select Committee and has said he was satisfied that there was no problem. So I was now being told by the officials, the Post Office and the union that there wasn't a problem. So it seemed to me perfectly reasonable for me to accept that collective view.
Was that, in your mind, the critical turning point, the views expressed by the, I think, the General Secretary of the NFSP?
Yes, it was. I had dealt with them before.
Had you dealt with him?
Not with him. Well, he'd met me, I think, on a couple of courtesy calls.
And sorry, just to make clear, who are you referring to?
Sorry, my first dealings with the Federation 15 years earlier had been with Mr. Baker.
Colin Baker, yes.
My second interaction had been when a representative, I'm not sure who it was, whether it was Mr. Thompson or a regional head, had come to see me about individual cases. And I had met Mr. Thompson, I think, on a couple of occasions. He'd come to talk about the progress of the transformation programme and the progress we were making on mutualisation. So that was the extent of my dealings with the union. But
had he, in your dealings with him, ever struck you as a tool?
Absolutely
meaning
not.
a tool of the post office?
Absolutely not. All my dealings with the Federation and him personally, it struck me as people of high integrity and who believed in what they were doing, as trade union officials do. I had no reason to doubt their integrity whatever.
Did you not need to see Second Sight's report in order to include a sentence or sentences such as these in the letter?
Well, I think given time, I probably would have done and should have done, but I think the context was that within a day or so of the end of Parliament, I was being pressed by the officials to get this letter out. I think even when I was given the reassurance about the Federation's view, I declined still to sign it because I was beginning to smell a rat. I mean, there was something going on here. And had Parliament continued, or had I been returned to office, I would have got all these people around the table, the Select Committee, Mr. Arbuthnot, the Post Office people, and for the first time, Mr. Bates. I'd not heard of him till this point, and I'd have got them all around the table and asked, what the hell's going on here? But I didn't have the time to do that, and I had to make a snap judgment about whether to send out this letter.
So if you had engaged with these issues, if you had read the judgments from the High Court, had paid attention to what was going on, you would have been able to say to the government at that time, in 2019, hang on, there's been a problem here. When I was looking at matters such as this, nobody brought this to my attention.
Well, had I known about it, I could possibly have intervened in the way you described, but when I came back into Parliament in 2017, government and opposition were completely overwhelmed by the big new issue, which is called Brexit. And as the leader of my party at the time, I was having to devote 100% of my time to focusing on that, apart from the time I spent on constituency issues. And I raised issues for constituents in Parliament, in debate and questions. I didn't range outside that. But there were many outstanding issues. One of the things which followed me was this Saudi arms deal, for example. And there were half a dozen issues like that I dealt with in Parliament, and I realised were still hanging around 2 years later, and I was being asked about them. But for the reasons I've given, I wasn't then in the business of dealing with post office issues.